we have Blaze Collar. This is not a super efficient minion by itself. Obviously, pales in comparison to some minions I haven't even necessarily seen a ton of play recently, like Fire Elemental. But if you are playing an Elemental-based deck, it's very powerful in combination with those things. Like, for instance, Fire Elemental on turn 6 into Blaze Collar on turn 7 is super, super strong. You get, a huge board swing from the Battlecry effect of the Blaze Collar if you're able to trigger it. And obviously, if you're following up another powerful board swinging Battlecry minion like Fire Elemental, it can be very, very powerful. So, as to whether this is sort of strong enough at the stage of the game in a lot of matchups that are likely to be popular, for instance, this doesn't really necessarily kill, like, say, your opponent's biggest Jade Golem, or it's very slow against Pirate Warrior. So if those styles of decks remain, like, super popular and we don't see minions that are about 5 health or similar to that seeing play at this sort of mana slot, it could be overshadowed by what else is going on. But I think it's a pretty powerful card. It's kind of like a Firelands Portal, and you're just guaranteed to get a 6/6, which, if you think about it that way, is pretty strong. But Firelands Portal is a bit more flexible because you don't necessarily have to set it up with something like an Elemental. So anyway, strong card, and I think it will see play in Elemental decks, and unlikely to be a superstar, but a powerful role player. Next up, we have Charged Devilsaur. I get the pun in the name. Charged Devilsaur, it has charge. But I like this as, a board control charge minion. We saw Ice Howl in Grand Tournament, and this is kind of like an Ice Howl, except eventually it can attack into heroes. It's not quite as powerful in terms of stats, obviously, but I think this is the kind of thing that is reasonable for, say, a Hunter deck to use as board control late in the game. Like a King Crush-ish thing, but obviously weaker than King Crush in this. Probably not going to be a constructed level superstar by any means, but certainly a strong arena level card. And maybe if you really want big sort of board control stuff that sticks around, can find some play in a beast deck. Maybe Beast Druid, like the 5+ cost 5 attack Druid deck, might want to play a card like this, because it triggers its synergistic cards, as well as can eventually win the game, providing board control when it comes down. Probably too weak overall, but definitely a cool card to see, going more in the direction of the charge stuff that can't attack heroes. All right, Giant Wasp. It's a new 3-drop stealth poisonous 2/2 beast. Kind of like a Patient Assassin that doesn't die to Fan of Knives quite so easily, and obviously is just a beast. Being able to be potentially buffed by Houndmaster, probably not a major thing, but you can get it from the random beast cards. I don't really expect this to be a card that we see a ton of in competitive play, just though it is, the fact that it is a stealth poisonous minion does mean that if there are, say, a lot of mid-range strong minions that you're looking to deal with, playing a mid-range deck of your own that doesn't necessarily have great ways to do that, you can sort of attack through and kill things without your opponent being able to easily interact with them. So could find some homes in that case. Also works well with Shadow Sensei. Oh man, you get boom. No, it doesn't nearly work as well as Shadow Sensei as Silent Knight does, but kind of amusing to think of it that way. Maybe you have your stealth theme deck. You're gonna work on the Giant Wasp. Maybe a poisonous theme deck. You're gonna include Giant Wasp. But I do think it's going to be a very powerful card in Arena, simply because being able to trade up with anything with your 3-drop and just having it sit there can be really, really valuable. Next up, we have what is potentially the weirdest card in the entire set, and that goes saying a lot because there's a lot of weird cards in this set. Hemet Jungle Hunter, a 6/6 for 6, so okay stats, not amazing stats, but decent stats. With Battlecry, destroy all cards in your deck that cost 3 or less. Now, what? First of all, what's going on here? But this is an interesting card if you're playing, say a control deck or say a mid-range deck that's playing a lot of low-cost stuff in order to remain competitive in the early game. Say you're playing a Hunter deck. Obviously, Hunter's kind of a weird example because the quest gives you a way to make use of your cheap stuff, but just say you're playing like a controlling or mid-range Hunter deck, and one of the problems you can have is drawing cards like Grievous Bite, the card we just talked about, when you actually get to the late stages of the game, and now suddenly you're drawing these low-impact cards. You're not really able to keep up with what your opponents are doing. But if you have Hemet, suddenly you're just drawing hits for the rest of the game, every card you draw costs at least 4 mana, so your average draw quality is so much higher than your opponent's is going to be. So you're just going to really overwhelm them with the overall power level of your cards. At least that's the idea. The idea is that you're not going to have those horrifically cheap things in your deck, and you can just blow them up. You can play it in, say, a Paladin deck that has Holy Wrath, and you're never going to have a terrible miss with your Holy Wrath once you get to fire Hemedoff. You could even have, just a bunch of super cheap things, and then nothing but super expensive cards, so you can eventually be guaranteed a gigantic Holy Wrath in your opponent. But anyway, overall, I just think this is a really interesting card. It's not obvious what you do with this card. It's a card that requires quite a bit of sort of like noodling out in your head and trying to figure out how you can possibly make use of it. Because in like long control games, you can get rid of all of your cheap removal spells, but you're also much closer to fatiguing than your opponent is. So is that worth it? Who knows? But overall, I'm super interested to see the fact that Blizzard is actually taking advantage of weird design space like this. And it's kind of like a Mana Severance card in Magic. Mana Severance, if you're not familiar with Magic, was a card that removed all the land from your deck. So now you're just drawing all non-land cards. So the average card quality that you pick, you draw is much stronger than your opponent's. Kind of the same thing that's going on here. But what exactly you do with it, who knows? And that's a really cool kind of design to me. Next up we have what I'm told might be the only dragon in Angora, which saddens me, because I'd love to see more dragons. But this is a pretty cool one. I think it's a little bit too weak for constructed play overall. It's a 4/8 taunt for 8. If this is maybe a little bit cheaper, I think that it might actually have some strong constructed applications. But it does have Battle Cry, deal 2 damage to all other minions, which can be very strong for wiping out boards full of small minions. I think it's a little bit too little damage to matter enough at that stage of the game, along with the not terribly impressive body, because things can just kind of attack into it and mostly survive. It's no Chill Maw, I'll tell you that much. It's no Chill Maw. But I do like the fact that there is a defensively oriented dragon. If you do want to play a dragon deck and not just all gigantic non-defensive legendary dragons like that exist in the classic set, this is an option for someone who wants to really wants to keep playing Draconid Operative because they just love stealing all their opponent's cards. But overall, I'm just not really impressed by this. I think it's a bit too expensive and unlikely to see much competitive play. Next up, we have Raveis Runt, which is a 2/2 for 2. If you control at least 2 other minions, adapt. I'm not really excited by this card. It's not a terribly interesting thing that it's doing. You're just getting a slightly better 2-drop if you already have a significant number of minions on the board. Yes, this could be in a deck with, say, Alley Cat, or with the Silverhand Recruits thing that gives you 2 1/1s on turn 1. Being able to play this following one of those up is quite strong. You can just play a pirate deck. Just play any pirate on 1, get your patches, play Raveis Runt on 2. Suddenly, you get a 2/5 or a 5/2 or whatever. It's not clear to me that this bonus on this 2-drop is really worth the effort you're putting into building it, but if you already have a deck that is utilizing those things that give you multiple minions for a single card or for very cheap, maybe it's worth it. But it's kind of adorable though. It's kind of like the Tiny Fin. But I hope that the gold version of this somehow has hearts floating above it too, like Tiny Fin did, just so there can be a minion that people can get that all of chat will want to protect the Runt. That's what this is best for. All right, next up we have Sated Threshodon. This is a funny card. The theme of it being it is a giant sea monster that has eaten Murlocs and you kill it and the Murlocs are freed. It's also a perfect card. It's a 5 out of 7. But other than that, not really a card that excites me from a competitive standpoint. We're not going to see this card seeing play, except if it comes off of a random beast effect. It's just not powerful enough. All right, next up we have Servant of Calamos. Battle Cry, if you played an elemental last turn, discover an elemental. Could be a reasonable value card for elemental decks. It's a little bit underpowered as far as what you expect from something at that stage of the game. I think that cards that allow you to discover that are cheap and understated are often strong, but I think that when you're spending 5 mana on something like this, it is not really generally going to be worth it. That said, there could be very powerful elementals you can discover, like Calamos or whatever, as he is the servant of him, or the Stone Sentinel. So maybe there are, because of the bias on the discover effect toward class cards, if a class has particularly strong elementals available, that maybe this could be worth playing in those decks. But my inclination is that 5 mana for something that is this low of an impact on the board immediately is likely not strong enough, and that if this were, say, cheaper, it would be much more likely to see play. But hard to justify spending half your turn on something which is just a 4/5 most of the time. Next up, we have Spirit Singer Umbra. This is kind of nuts. Whenever you summon a minion, trigger its Death Rattle effect. 3/4 for 4. So this is one of the reasons, I imagine, that we no longer have Sylvanas available in Standard, that she rotated to the Hall of Fame, because one of the things that was said was that, there's a lot of powerful Death Rattle things. Well, here's a powerful Death Rattle thing. And, there's lots of, even just cheap cards you can play alongside this in the same turn that you can get, pretty high impact for. So I could very easily see this in a, Death Rattle focused deck of any class. Obviously, Priest has a ton of Death Rattle focused stuff in the class for this expansion that we've seen with the quest and everything. Hunter. Hunter has lots of powerful Death Rattle effects that you can play immediately. Like, play this alongside a Kindly Grandmother, play this alongside Rat Pack. If it gets to survive a turn, it's like you get to Savannah Highmane or whatever. Just lots of very, very powerful things. You can get multiple triggers of the Death Rattles of minions. Super strong. So I'm definitely, looking forward to messing around with this card because it's a powerful one. All right, next up we have Stonehill Defender. We saw this in the Warrior Quest deck for the stream, and it's a reasonable card. A 1/4 taunt for 3 is obviously not powerful by itself, but it's effectively drawing you a card, and it's better than draw a card in a lot of cases because it's getting you additional resource that you can select from with the Discover effect. But I think this is clearly a powerful card in a deck that cares about the number of taunt minions it has, like the Taunt Warrior. It's kind of like the I Know a Guy, except it actually is giving you a taunt on top of that. So it's in a way going to be better in a lot of cases because you're just getting the body that you clearly want anyway because you're playing a taunt deck. Kind of sad that Bolster is leaving Standard because all these taunt things, and especially things that generate multiple taunts for a single card like Stonehill Defender, go very well with Bolster. Obviously it doesn't generate it itself, but giving you multiple taunt minions for the investment of a single card slot is very valuable. This is particularly strong in either decks that care about having those multiple taunt minions like Warrior, or potentially just like in, say, Paladin. Paladin doesn't have that many taunt minions in its class, and the ones it does have are like Sunkeeper Tarim and Tyrion. So playing Stonehill Defender to get extra shots at putting more of those in your deck seems like it has the potential to be very strong. So it's kind of an innocuous card, but I feel like this could be a very, very powerful card in the right decks. All right, next up we have Stubborn Gastropod. Pretty straightforward card. 2/1 Poisonous Taunt for 2. If you don't know what Poisonous is, means if it damages something, it kills it. New keyword. And yeah, this is, I don't think, a particularly strong card for Constructed, simply because there's lots of cheap weapons and cheap damage-based removal that can get by it. I think it's probably going to be a pretty powerful arena card because you can play it at sort of any stage of the game, and your opponent is going to usually have to spend some sort of resource that's meaningful to kill it. Because they're less likely to have things like cheap weapons and such. It's also just potentially a strong card to play sort of in the middle turns. Obviously, playing this in turn 2 usually just trades with your opponent's 2-drop or even like their 1-drop in hero power. But in the middle turns, if your opponent is playing like just a normal mid-range deck, they're often going to be sort of thrown off curve trying to get through this without actually sacrificing meaningful resource. So it's kind of a neat thing if you expect to play against a bunch of big minions. This is a great way to answer them. Kind of like an Annoyotron. Annoyotron was always like kind of awkward against small minions, wasn't that good, but it was really good against big minions because your opponent had to like hit with a big minion and then hit with another big minion to get through it. Whereas this, less good against weapons, obviously, than Annoyotron was, but still good against big minions. We have Thunder Lizard. 3-cost, 3/3. Battle Cry if you played an elemental last turn. Adapt. So this is very much an overstated minion, kind of like a Tinkertown Technician of elementals. If you have reasonable 2-cost elementals in your deck, or even like 1-cost elementals that you might also play on 2, this can be a very strong minion early in the game. And we've seen like a number of this. We see Tinkertown Technician, we see Blackwing Technician, we see now Thunder Lizard. So like the point in the game where the new tribal thing can start really giving you an advantage at neutral is apparently 3 mana. I don't think this is a super exciting card. It may be pretty powerful if you do have a class that has enough of the cheap elementals to curve into this on a regular basis, because Adapt is fairly strong. Getting a 4/4 or a 3/6 or Divine Shield on this at 3 mana, it's going to be a strong minion against pretty much everything. Even just stealth, in the right deck can be pretty meaningful because your opponent can't just attack it down easily. And then if you have other ways to take advantage of it. Maybe you're playing an Elemental Beast Hunter deck, and you can make this guy have +3 health, and then you Houndmaster it. Oh my god, not going to happen. But just think of it. But yeah, pretty staple, just like, tribal thing. We'll see play if you have the right support. Won't if it doesn't. Next up, we have Turtle Sauron, or Servant of Yogg Turtle. This is basically a Servant of Yogg Sauron with more control over it, but more control in the sense that you want to take things that don't have targets because you have a Discover effect. So, if you can choose something like, say, Kabbalist Tome, or Flame Strike, or, Doom, pretty powerful effect. But if it's a Fireball or whatever, it's going to be a lot weaker. It's just just kind of a wacky card. I don't expect this to really ever see, competitive play, kind of like Servant of Yogg Sauron. For very much the same reason. It's just too unreliable, and this also just costs 8 mana. It's so expensive. Obviously, the Discover effect means that you have much more control over what you're getting, so you have to pay a fairly significant amount to get that, because you could get a Doom or whatever. It's not actually mana constrained like Servant of Yogg Sauron was. So maybe this is a good arena card because it's reasonable enough in terms of the body that you're getting, because you get the spell tacked onto it, because it's kind of like card draw, which can be tough to come by in arena sometimes. But I don't know. I'm not gonna be playing with this card in Constructed, even though it's kind of a crazy card. Maybe I will. You're gonna come back and quote me on this later, and you're like, you said you would never play Tutorial Primalist, but this one time you decided to make a ridiculous random meme deck, and here we are. So I don't know. Just a goofy fun card more than a competitive card, certainly. And next up we have Volatile Elemental. Well, this is a 2-cost elemental that you can play and potentially curve into the Thunder Lizard. This is a kind of interesting card. It's clearly a defensively oriented early minion. It is a juggle effect that is guaranteed to hit a minion, so it makes it difficult for your opponents to try and trade easily in the early game and protect their own minions. It's great against weapons. If your opponent tries to kill your Volatile Elemental with a weapon, it's guaranteed to still hit one of their minions. It's obviously not particularly good against very small minions. So if your opponent is playing like Pirate Warrior and has a swarm of 1/1s, it's not really going to be very effective against that, because it does just trade off with one of those 1/1s. But if they're playing more substantial early minions, it can be a very, very strong card to trade off, especially if you think about a Death Rattle deck, like a priest deck with, say, the Quest with the Mirror guy. It can be a very powerful thing that you can mirror on turn 3 against a minion-based deck to remove their board. So maybe you use the Death Rattle thing in Hunter, the guy who triggers the Death Rattle of this guy on turn 3. And your opponent's like, oh, well, I'm not going to trade off with it because I'm going to get my damage into your face. And you're like, haha, got you. But it's going to be difficult to get this effectively used with either of those for that reason, though, because people will obviously see that kind of telegraphed to them by the fact that, hey, this will kill my minion anyway, so I might as well trade with it now. And I don't want to give you the ability to get multiple uses of it. All right, next up we have Bitter Tide Hydra, which is a 5-cost 8/8 beast. Whenever it takes damage, deal 3 damage to your hero. It's kind of like just a big drawback minion, kind of like a Fel Reaver. It's obviously the exact same cost and stats as Fel Reaver, so it fits right into that category. This is a strong card, I think, against control decks, and a very, very, very bad card against aggressive decks. If you're able to, play this just as a cheap beast in, say, a Hunter deck against Control Warrior or against, Control Mage, Warlock, whatever, it's gonna be great. But if you play it against Pirate Warrior, you are going to die on the spot. It's a beast, so it does fit well into a Hunter deck at sort of the top of their curve if they're ultra aggressive, which is probably where this would want to live. You don't really want to play in a mid-range deck that is going to try to live much longer after this, because your opponent can potentially just whirlwind you, ping your guy down, whatnot. Maybe this fits into a Silence type deck, a Purified Priest style deck, but it's pretty late in the curve in order to be worth getting that Silence on. I feel like you really want to get your Silences on the early game stuff that can then help control the board in order to justify the expense. So maybe it has a home, but certainly a very high risk, high reward card. Next up we have Bright Eyed Scout, a 4-cost 3/4 with Battlecry, draw a card, change its cost to 5. This is a very weird card. It's potentially very powerful in a deck full of very big things. You can play this, and whatever you drew off of it next turn. It's going to be Maybe it's a card that you play in like a ramp druid deck. Maybe it's a card you play in like a gigantic minion-filled deck of any class, really. You don't even necessarily have to be a ramp druid deck, but ramp druid has more ways to play the other big things that you ramped into that you would also draw off the Bright-Eyed Scout. But also, you know, if you Bright-Eyed Scout into like an Innervate, well, your Innervate is now totally useless because it costs 5. Kind of a card that fits into the same sort of deck as like an Astral Communion, for instance. I think Astral Communion is going away into Wild. I think that's a Grand Tournament card. Definitely a card that can create some highlight reel moments, but I don't think it's consistent enough to be a really high-level competitive card. But we'll certainly see play in some wacky decks that are looking to do crazy things early. Next up we have Devilsaur Egg, the older brother or older sister of Nerubian Egg. So Nerubian Egg was particularly good with like buffs like Power Overwhelming, which is going away to Wild. Abusive Sergeant, which has taken a big hit in terms of its power level with the nerf, and Dark Iron Dwarf, which is still pretty good, or is at least still the same amount of good, but maybe is not quite good enough at this stage of the game to get a Devilsaur Egg into something that it's relevant with. It does work very well with the minion that we saw earlier that sacrifices a minion to double adapt. Being able to curve those two could be quite strong. We don't have like Void Terror anymore as well. I believe Void Terror went out. So we're not going to see, that style of sacrificing for your Devilsaur Eggs, but ways to break the Devilsaur Egg are pretty plentiful. People like egg decks. We see lots of Paladin egg decks or Druid egg decks, like ways to use buffs on things that if your opponent kills them, you just get something out of it is always pretty attractive too. So I do expect that this is a card we'll see play. I don't think it's nearly as good as Nerubian Egg, but there's a lot of space to be worse than Nerubian Egg and still be a powerful card. Is Void Terror classic? Shows what I know. Void Terror is a classic card. You can Void Terror it. Go ahead, do it. I don't play much Warlock. All right, next up we have Egg Napper, which is a 3-cost 3/1 with Death Rattle. Summon 2 1/1 raptors. First of all, it's kind of funny. The art is this like turtle guy stealing raptor eggs, and clearly you kill him, he drops them, they hatch raptors. I don't think it's a very powerful card. If it is a good card, it's potentially a good card in a deck that's looking to sacrifice its minions. Maybe with Void Terror, that Warlock card in Classic. But mostly a deck that is looking to have like a number of minions in play to manifest various synergies. But overall, I think this is probably just a weak card. 3/1 for 3, too vulnerable to hero powers and things like that in order to be reasonably competitive. Maybe a decent arena card though. All right, this is a really cool card. Emerald Hive Queen. It's a 1-cost 2/3 with your minions cost 2 more. This is kind of like a Zombie Chow, in that it is a powerful card in a deck that's looking to play a slower game and not necessarily actually beat you down with its early minion, but use it to defend itself. It obviously is a worse card than Zombie Chow in like a tempo deck that's just looking to fight for the board with Zombie Chow and back it up with other minions, because, well, you're not going to really play other minions very easily after the Emerald Hive Queen. But it's a great minion in a deck that has very few minions and is just looking to stave off getting beat down. I think this is going to be a great card in like a Control Priest deck. Control Priest is a deck that loved Zombie Chow before, even if Zombie Chow was one of the only early minions in the deck. This is a great card in a Control Priest deck against, say, Pirate Warrior, because you just drop a 1-cost 2/3. It isn't easily killed by patches, isn't easily killed by like even an upgraded N'Zoth's first mate weapon, the Rusty Hook. Takes essentially a War Axe swing to take down. So I think this is a great card. I think this is going to be a very powerful card for long game oriented control decks that are mostly spell heavy. And I love that a card like this exists because I've really, really missed Zombie Chow, and we haven't seen Mistress of Mixtures nearly live up to that sort of role in the metagame. So definitely stoked for Emerald Hive Queen and think it will be a very important card in a lot of decks. Next up we have Emerald Reaver. I think Emerald Reaver and Emerald Hive Queen just don't really get along because they clearly go in very different decks. Emerald Reaver is kind of the new Leper Gnome of sorts. Obviously not as powerful as Leper Gnome, but with Battlecry, deal 1 to each hero. It is a 2/1 that gets a little bit of incremental extra damage in if you're playing an aggressive deck. Obviously, kind of a drawback against other aggressive decks because you hit yourself as well. But if you're looking for a 1-drop for a deck that's looking to go face very quickly, this could very well make the cut. Next up we have Fire Plume Phoenix, which is a neutral elemental. 3/3 for 4, Battlecry, deal 2 damage. Probably not good enough to see constructed play, though depending on the size of the minions that are seeing play, it's possible that being able to shoot things down for 2 could be enough to swing boards at that stage of the game. My guess is it isn't, because most of the things that we see that are relevant at those stages of the game have at least 3 health. So maybe you can do some incremental damage somehow and help kill them off. But it's super strong in Arena. This card I think is likely to be totally busted in Arena to help finish things off. But I don't think it's going to be quite strong enough to see constructed play. Next up we have Frozen Crusher, which is a 6-cost 8/8. After it attacks, freeze it. So this is potentially just a reasonable card to use as a minion to kill your opponent's stuff. Obviously, it's much bigger than most things at its cost. And if you're using it effectively as like a delayed removal spell that can potentially then attack face or kill another thing, maybe that's reasonable. If you're playing like a Purify Priest deck, maybe that's reasonable. But again, I think that Purify style Priest decks want to be playing cheap undercosted stuff so they can gain control of the board when they're using their Purify or Silence or Cabal Song Stealer to shut down those drawbacks. You definitely want things more like Ancient Watcher and Eerie Statue than like Frozen Crusher in that deck. So my guess is this really won't find a home anywhere, but if it does, it'll be Purify Priest. All right, next up we have Giant Mastodon, which is a 6/10 taunt for 9. If you're in the market for a gigantic taunt or in the market for a gigantic beast, this is a card for you. This seems like a potentially very strong Arena card, just because, again, huge taunt minions tend to be pretty good in Arena. And Arena has like somewhat slowed down from being the 2-drop tempo dominated format that it once was. I am by no means an Arena expert, but this does seem it could be strong there. I am somewhat more of an expert at Constructed, and it will not be good there. So let's just move right along. Next up we have Humongous Razor Leaf. Now this is a Purify Priest card. This is an insane card if you're looking to silence it and control the early game with it, because well, it has 4 attack, which is enough to kill almost anything in the early turns of the game, and it has 8 health, which is exactly what you want when you're playing Priest, is a ton of health to heal and kill your opponent's stuff. It's also great to play this and taunt it up. 4 attack, tough to attack into. 8 health, tough to kill. So if there is a card that is, the Purify Priest card of this expansion, I think the Razor Leaf is it. And I'm going to be trying to find out whether Purify Priest really could work once Agoro comes around, and this is why. Next up we have Igneous Elemental, which is a fairly poorly statted, it's a 2/3 for 3. With Death Rattle, add 2 1/2 elementals to your hand. My guess is that this won't be a constructed level card because it is just poorly statted and doesn't have enough of an impact on the board. It's possible that the elemental synergies are A, so powerful, and B, so important to ensure you have the ability to manifest that it'll be worth having a card that can effectively trigger your elemental synergies 3 times. For when you absolutely, positively want to trigger your 3/5 with Divine Shield or your Stone Sentinel or whatever else, this is the best way to do it probably. But that said, I still think it's probably just too low of an impact for the mana cost in terms of what you're getting early in the game. So my guess is that this won't see constructed competitive play, but I'm willing to be wrong if there's enough demand for cheap elementals. All right, next up we have Nesting Rock. This is, I think, a really interesting card. Battlecry, if you control at least 2 other minions, gain taunt, and it's a 4/7 beast. So one thing that I've really been looking forward to, or looking for, is some sort of defensive minion for Hunter. I constantly try and build these like mid-range Hunter decks, and then when I don't draw Houndmaster, I'm dead. And for a long time, we saw like Sludge Belcher, for instance, being a very popular card in mid-range Hunter because you really need to defend yourself to get the time to kill your opponent with Savannah Highmane and your hero power. With Nesting Rock, if you're playing like a deck that is, whether it's built for like the quest or just happens to have Rat Pack or whatever, a 4/7 taunt for 5 is like very easily going to happen for you because you have lots of ways to get 2 other minions in play. And this can easily, protect you from, say, Pirate Warrior, who like is just going face. You're like, well, you went face and I hit my guy into yours, got my tokens and played a Nesting Rock, and now you're totally wrecked. Because now I'm just going to keep Dinomancying it and you're never getting through my like gigantic beast with taunt. I've actually just really wanted a beast with taunt for a long time, and this is a great one that, unlike a lot of other cards, can't just go and be slotted easily into other decks. So I think this is a great card. I think it's actually going to be very, very good in a lot of mid-range Hunter decks, and I'm super looking forward to playing it. Next card, Pterodax Hatchling. 3-cost, 2/2, Battlecry Adapt. Meh. Pretty basic vanilla card with the new mechanic. Not going to be a card that we see in competitive play. It's just too understated, but you need this sort of card to just show off the very basics of what a mechanic does. Next up we have Rockpool Hunter, which is a 2-cost, 2/3 Murloc with Battlecry. Give a friendly Murloc +1/+1. This card may look like kind of innocuous, like it's just a 2-cost 2/3, but the fact that it's a Murloc that A, can help buff other Murlocs and help them survive, and B, itself isn't embarrassingly low statted is a really big deal. This is like very valuable for any kind of Murloc deck that wants to kind of play like an honest game of Hearthstone rather than just being like a Finja combo deck or whatever. In particular, I think that we're going to see potentially the Murloc quest in Shaman be like very, very powerful. There's lots of cool tools available for Shaman, like calling the finishers and just all sorts of stuff like that that are already, I think, close to being competitive as like a Murloc deck. And obviously having tools like this that can make your otherwise relatively unimpressive Murlocs pretty powerful, I think is really strong. Like the Murloc Tidecaller, for instance, the 1-cost 1/2 that gets +1 whenever you play another Murloc. You play like that into this, and you have, basically built yourself a Totem Golem on turn 1. And then, if you discover more of this guy, or you then play like a, Warlord the following turn, you're just kind of rushing people down, and it's pretty powerful. Anyway, I think it's a solid card, and it'll definitely see play as a way to make like honest non-combo Murloc decks more viable. Next up we have Sabretooth Stalker. 8/2 stealth for 6. Get him. Look at me just jumping out of the mist there. Very stealthy. This is not a card we're going to see in high-level competitive decks. Could be good in Arena as just like kind of a, just hides in the mist and leaps out at their Bog Creeper because it has the 8 attack that goes right into its 8 health. Or just gets them for 8 right in the face. Like, boom, getcha. But yeah, not really strong enough to justify seeing constructed play. Even if you do just get to hit them in the face, it's very difficult to get through something taunt-wise and survive with the 2 health. Next up we have Stormwatcher. It was a 4/8 elemental with Wind Fury for 7. Ben Brode made the point that a high health Wind Fury minion is much more likely to live than a lower health Wind Fury minion, so it's going to get multiple attacks more often, but that will basically happen in Arena because you won't see this in Constructed. The Vorax is kind of an all-in-one buff recipient. This is, another card like the Murloc or the Djinn who is going to be going away with the League of Explorers when it rotates out of Standard. That you want to buff this. The Djinn, you want it to buff something else and buff the Djinn. This guy, you just pile your buffs in this guy, and lots of very powerful things that you can chain off with this. Unlike the Djinn, you just want to have this guy in play and powered shield him. And then suddenly, you get another plant that also gets powered shielded. One of the problems is that in the Paladin class, for instance, there's no immediate payoff for piling buffs on this guy. There's no powered shield type effect where you just immediately are generating additional resources. You have to have him in play and have him survive a turn to get any cards off of Blessing of Wisdom, for instance. You can potentially use Hand of Protection to try and keep him alive to the next turn, but it requires a lot, I think, to really feel like you're getting a ton of value off of this, unless you just have a bunch of spells you can cast in one turn, so you're getting a bunch of plants that all have these, and then you're supposed to deal with all of them. This, I think, is actually at its best with high value spells like the portals, like Silver Moon Portal or Blessing of Kings, things that are generating a lot of value for the plant rather than just generating cards like Powered Shield would. So, cool card, and I think that we'll definitely see it in those buff heavy decks, but clearly won't have a much of a home elsewhere. Next up we have Ultrasore! And then we have the next card. This is, by the way, a waste of a name. That's my biggest critique of this card. This is a waste of a name. Ultrasore should be way cooler than a 7/14 vanilla 10-cost beast. There's my tip to you. Don't waste Ultrasore on this guy. Next up we have Vicious Fledgling. After this minion attacks a hero, adapt. It's a powerful effect, for sure. You're effectively getting an adaptation for 0 mana once you get there, but you have to have your 3-cost 3/3 survive and attack your opponent's hero, which seems like a fairly tall order. I think that you're better off playing the Thunder Lizard, which just gets to adapt if you have a elemental. You're getting, obviously that only goes in an elemental deck, but I think it's a much more reliable way to actually have your minions survive than just trying to play this guy and pray. Anyway, I think that is actually every single card in the set, so maybe I missed something, who knows, but yeah, I'm super excited for Ungoro. There's tons of really cool things that I definitely am sort of champing the bit to actually get a chance to build decks with and play with. I'm super excited about all of the quests. They're definitely all really interesting to explore. Anyway, thank you guys very much for tuning in to this card review. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're as excited for Journey to Un'Goro as I am.